This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
When you think about Egypt in the Bible, what do you think of? Probably the Exodus would come to mind first. In academic circles, the question of if the Exodus even happened is often debated. And actually, many would say that there isn't any evidence of the Israelites being in Egypt at all during this time. Well, Henry got a chance to talk with Dr. Titus Kennedy about a bunch of different pieces of evidence that are related to Egypt and the Exodus. Dr. Kennedy is a field archaeologist and has been involved in excavations and surveys at several archaeological sites, including the Khirbet et Tel excavations and the Jerusalem Mount Zion excavations. He's written a few books, including Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, the Archaeological and History of Christ in the Gospels. But some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is from one of his other books called Unearthing the Bible, 101 Discoveries That Bring the Bible to Life. Here's Henry.
Titus, welcome back to Digging for Truth.
Thanks, Henry. Great to be back.
Hey, it's great to have you back on the show. Now, when we say back on the show, the reason for that is because you were with us for 2 episodes previously. You have a great story, too, about how you became an archaeologist and your interest in history. But we're going to take our time today to jump right into the question of the Exodus. So people know, of course, the story in the Bible as a general statement. The Israelites were in Egypt. They came out of Egypt under Moses, and they entered the land of Canaan. So let's place them in that context in Egypt to begin with and sort of set the stage for our conversation.
Yeah, so the Bible gives us a timeline. And for those who have been following ABR and reading articles, you're probably familiar with these main arguments. But the key passage comes from 1 Kings 6:1. It tells us it's the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, after the Exodus, is the 4th year of Solomon. And because we have very firm, solid dates for the reign of Solomon, we can calculate back to that Exodus date. So basically, 967 BC is about the 4th year of Solomon. Add 479 years to that, you get to about 1446 BC. But, of course, you have people with different ideas about the Exodus date. And I'd say generally people fall into 3 camps. Either they're 15th century BC, 13th century BC, or they think it's mythological.
Yeah, and there are a variety of views out there. In fact, we did a series with Scott Stripling on the date itself, laying out the argument for the date that you and I are going to be advocating. So the date, middle of the 15th century BC, around 1446 is the Exodus. So obviously the Israelites have been living in the land for several centuries. And so that's sort of the stage we want to set. So it would make sense. We want to look for archaeological evidence. If the biblical account is true, which we say it is there evidence? Is there evidence of a presence of Semitic Israelite people living in the land? That's really the fundamental question we want to start with. Right.
So we're going to be looking at, is there evidence that Israelites or Hebrews were in Egypt in the 18th dynasty or even earlier in the Second Intermediate period? And the key site, at least right now, would be the archaeological site of Tel el-Daba, or also known by its ancient names of Avaris and Ramses. That one has been extensively excavated. Of course, it's also mentioned in Exodus 1. And so that is a great place to start to see if there's some match and some evidence.
All right, so maybe we begin with something like, Moses met with the Pharaoh in a palace. We read that actually explicitly in the text, right? That he went to see Pharaoh in the morning, those kind of references. So let's start there. What kind of evidence has been found that could be connected to those statements?
Well, the excavation there at Tel el-Daba actually found an 18th dynasty palace that was situated on the branch of the Nile River. And that fits exactly with what we read in the text of Exodus about the palace being located there at Avaris or Ramses, and with the palace being right next to the river.
So that would fit the narrative. Now you're saying 18th dynasty. This is a period of time that's really generally thought of as sort of the height of Egyptian power. How would you say that correlates with the text, just that general way of looking at the 18th dynasty?
Well, the 18th dynasty earlier on, I think we definitely could say that it is the height of Egypt's power. Through the time of Thutmose III, Egypt is expanding, becoming more powerful. We could look later in the 18th dynasty, and they're not conducting military campaigns and expanding Egypt like they did before. There is some internal development going on, but it's not the same type of thing. They don't have the same kind of force and international power as earlier in the 18th dynasty. So if we're looking at the Exodus coming in the middle of that, then it explains some things in the historical context.
Now, another thought is, as they're excavating this site, which they've been doing over 50 years, you would expect, because the way the Bible describes it, that a significant population grew of these, what we call Semites or Semitic peoples, the descendants of Jacob. What are some things that would point to that in the cultural material that's been uncovered in that time?
Well, there are a number of things from material culture excavated at the site that would connect to people who had migrated over from Canaan, who we might call Semites, or who the Egyptians called Asiatics, and the Israelites certainly fit into that designation. So we have things like over 20% of the pottery is of this, what we might call Canaanite type. And then we have burials that are made in the type that people from Canaan or the Levant were doing. We have temples and gods that have been imported from that area. We have actually 2 statues of Asiatic officials, so people like Joseph who rose up in the ranks, but they weren't Egyptians. We also have remains of sheep and goats, and the sheep specifically, we can tell that they were brought in from the Levant, from the Canaan region, because they're this long-haired variety.
Yeah, see, these are the kind of details in archaeology that's really remarkable. It fits very nicely with the biblical narrative. So the sense of it is, the people of descendants of Jacob, they come into the land, they grow, and then you find this material culture that fits.
Right. One of the really interesting discoveries at Tel El Daba, this Ramses site, are numerous storage silos that they excavated from the 18th dynasty, from this just before Exodus period. I think that is incredibly significant because of the connection that we could make with that in Exodus 1:11, where it says that the Israelites were forced to build these storage facilities in Ramses, Pithom, and Heliopolis for the Septuagint.
So now you wanted to address the question of the use of the term Ramses because he was the great pharaoh of a later period in the 13th century. And so people argue, well, it says Ramses in the text, so it must be 13th century. But it's also mentioned in Genesis 47:11, which is way back at the time of Joseph. So what's going on there with that? How do we explain that not anomaly, but how do we explain the name Ramses in the text?
So Ramses in Egyptian is a name. It's not restricted to Ramses II the Great. It just means born of Ra. And this name is actually attested from earlier time periods. For example, in the 16th century BC, we have a couple of people named Ramses. So even before the 18th dynasty and at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, we know that name is in use per Egyptian records. Also, this city, what it later becomes called Ramses, it was not established, or it wasn't occupied first under Ramses II. It was actually built early on, expanded from Avaris, at least by the time of Horemheb, Pharaoh Horemheb, decades earlier. So just defaulting to Ramses II for the Exodus doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's good, and I think that provides a helpful explanation. All right, there's a ton. We could do several episodes just on the Egyptian context there in that area, but we do want to cover some other artifacts. One is Papyrus Brooklyn. Now, we talked about this in our previous episode with you, but I'd like to just touch on it a little bit, just remind our audience of how important this document is.
Right. So one of the major criticisms of an Israelite Exodus is that supposedly there's no evidence that Hebrews or Israelites lived in Egypt prior to the Exodus. But then enters Papyrus Brooklyn, which is essentially a list of household slaves or servants from the Thebes area about the 17th century BC, in the Second Intermediate period. But on that, you have at least 9 Hebrew names appearing. So if you're looking for evidence of Hebrews in Egypt prior to the Exodus, you really can't ask for much more than that.
Yeah, it's interesting when I've thought about this, Titus. We have the particulars of archaeology. It's like what constitutes proof for something? The Bible describes the set of events occurring with the Exodus. What constitutes proof? You have a papyrus from the time period with Hebrew and Semitic names, and some of them, like the name of one of the Midrash, Shifra, is actually on the papyrus. So, aside from videography, what constitutes proof for historians and archaeologists? It's always a troubling question to me.
Right. Sometimes the level of corroboration expected for certain biblical stories is so high that it is not comparable to what would be used for other time periods, works of literature, historical arguments, etc. I mean, if we were looking for evidence of Minoans or Hittites living in Egypt, even a small group of them, and then we found Minoan names or we found Hittite names, Egyptologists would not be so questioning about, oh, okay, there were some Hittites there were some Minoans there.
Yeah, I agree. I think we can see in that inconsistency in methodology and level of proof. But we can't detain ourselves there. Now we want to shift to another papyrus. And this is something that you've been studying. It is controversial, called the Ipuwer papyrus, or the Admonitions of.
So the Admonitions of Ipuwer is a lamentation poem. It's very interesting for many reasons, but there's only one copy of it that has ever been found from antiquity. And this particular papyrus dates to the 13th century, 19th dynasty Ramesside period. We know that because it was probably looted from a Ramesside period tomb, and also the style of the lettering fits that time period. It wasn't found in a controlled excavation. It actually appeared on the antiquities market in about 1828, and it was sold to the Dutch government. But no one has said that it's inauthentic. So it's been verified as authentic. We just don't know the exact place that it was pulled from. But within this poem, you have this author named Ipuwer, who is describing this time of chaos and destruction and death and sort of an upside down world in Egypt, where the gods of Egypt are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not helping. And he questions this God called the All Lord, and he questions the Pharaoh. Now, some people reading this have noticed that there are passages in there that sound a whole lot like some of the Exodus plagues narrative. And so this connection has been proposed before, but usually it's thrown off for a couple of reasons. One is the presupposition that the Exodus is mythical, and the Admonitions of Ipuwer is just sort of a allegorical type of poem. It's also not historical, they're saying. The second is that they claim that the composition of the Admonitions of Ipuwer was way too early to be associated with the Exodus, ranging anywhere from the first intermediate period, Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period. Okay, all of them would generally be too early. And so I was trying to address both of these issues. Could it have been composed around the time of the Exodus? And secondly, what are the really detailed parallels? Does it go beyond just a probable or possible coincidence to the point where you really start wondering, could this have been an Egyptian poetic account of that time of the plagues?
Now, just for clarification for our audience, the papyrus itself is dated from the 13th century BC, but most people agree that the original is much older. So the question is, when did it originate, because that would be the key to determining whether it could be connected to the Exodus. But I'm going to let you sort of walk us through this particular document and share your observations.
Right. So it's generally dated between the first intermediate period to the second intermediate period, which would be too early for common Exodus dating. But this is based on a presupposition that it's allegorical and it's just describing the mood of chaos. All right. So they're not really looking at it as could this have been historical. But if we do an in-depth examination of the language used in this papyrus, we see that there are words and phrases that don't come into use until the 18th dynasty. So at the very least, we would have to say that the thing was totally rewritten in the 18th dynasty with new updated language, all right? But if we allow for the possibility that was its original composition date, then we can look at, does it have a link to some events that were in the 18th dynasty? Second thing I'd say about the date is the name Ipuwer. So the name Ipuwer is actually found on an inscription from the necropolis of Thebes dating to the co-regency between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. So just in this pre-Exodus period. He's also found in 19th dynasty tomb and an inscription about kind of great writers of the past, and he's described as the overseer of singers. So he was some kind of bard, and that fits with the poetic part of it.
So the idea, one of the things that you emphasize in your argument, and you're going to be writing an article for our magazine Bible and Spade, is that poetry can be historical in terms of what it's pointing to. We see that in the Psalms. The Psalms talk about the Exodus, and they point to the narrative text. So that doesn't necessarily eliminate the historicity of this thing, even though it's poetic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the two historical examples that come to mind is the Lament for Ur, which is a historical event about when the Elamites attacked Ur, and then the Lamentations of Jeremiah, which talks about the Babylonians attacking Jerusalem. All right, both of those are historical events. It's the same type of writing as we find in Ipuwer.
Okay, so let's have a little bit of fun here. We'll get to possibly the coolest connection, I think, and then we'll kind of work our way through it, and having to do with the Nile River.
So this is the most obvious parallel, and probably the one that people first noticed between the Exodus, because he says that the river is blood. As one drinks of it, one shrinks from people and thirsts for water. So anyone familiar with the Exodus plague story immediately, oh, that sounds a whole lot like when we read about Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh warning him, and then the Nile River is turned to blood. And people obviously can't get water from the river if it's blood.
Yeah, so 2 points there is the Nile River was everything for ancient Egyptians. I mean, if the Nile River turned blood, they're in big trouble in every single way because everything surrounding there is desert, except up in the Delta region. The second part of that is it doesn't say it looks like blood, or it says it is blood in both texts. Am I right about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a simile. He's claiming, well, both texts are claiming that the river is blood, and they both talk about blood being throughout the land of Egypt.
Yeah, see, that's a fascinating connection. So again, not enough to say this is the Exodus for sure, but again, your argument entails other things, the name Ipuwer, the uncertainty of dating it earlier and those kind of things. But let's move ahead a little bit here. One of the other connecting points is in the fifth plague having to do with domesticated animals. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it talks about a pestilence or a plague coming upon all these animals. So we've got some passages in Ipuwer like pestilence is throughout the land. There's no lack of death, right? So some type of plague or pestilence is striking creatures down. And then we have it talking about the herds of animals and cattle, how they're moaning, they're in pain. They're also in pain because of how terrible things are in Egypt. But there's something that's affecting life, and it's even affecting the animals, okay? A possible link to this Exodus plague that affected the animals.
All right, so let's make another connection. So there we have allusions actually to cattle mourning, as you mentioned, and some some pestilence going on in the land. That would fit the context of Exodus. Now, the text of Ippur does not mention locusts, but it does seem to talk about what could be the after effect of locusts. Talk about that a little bit.
There are a number of passages in Ippur that talk about how the agriculture of the land has been destroyed, and not just in broad terms. It's talking about like there's nothing left on the trees, or the grain has been destroyed, and it doesn't specify all of this. I mean, there are passages that talk about fire burning things, but there's something that's happened that has just wiped out, taken away all of the food sources. And if we're looking again in the context of the Exodus, well, the locusts sweep through and they eat all of the fruit on the trees and the vegetables and everything that's planted.
Yeah, and so in summary, we have these three main connections, and we're going to continue on with that. Let's make another connection between the papyrus and the plagues, and that is the most infamous of the plagues, the terrifying 10th plague recorded in Exodus.
So that 10th plague obviously is the death of the firstborn. And so there are a lot of people dying in Egypt, we read in the text of Exodus. And if we go to Ippur, we have some interesting parallels there. For example, he says, "He who places his brother in the earth is everywhere." There's also talk about lamentation being throughout the land. There are passages that talk about the Pharaoh being rebelled against and the palace is fallen. So the Pharaoh is involved in this chaos too. It's affecting him also. There's even another text, the dream stele at the Sphinx, that connects into this 10th plague.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, like someone who's skeptical could sort of take that one data point and pull it out and say, well, could have been a famine, could have been some kind of natural disaster, and so on. The point that you're making, and that we often make on the show, is that it's a matrix of evidence. So if multiple lines point to the possibility of connecting it, then this fits with the narrative. People are being buried everywhere. Well, that really does connect. It's not inconsistent, it's very consistent.
Yeah, exactly. So if we just have one parallel, maybe two parallels, interesting things like the Nile River turning to blood and some people dying, or even like the agriculture suffers from some pestilence or insects, then we might say, oh, that's just a coincidence. But as you mentioned, when we have several different data points, several different parallels, and we're looking at a similar time period, then we have to answer the question, well, what is the best explanation of the evidence that we have? Is it that these things are completely different, they have no relation at all, or is it possible that they could have a correlation? And actually, in a publication on the Ippur papyrus, probably by the foremost scholar in the world on this text, he says that he sees the parallels between the Ippur poem and the account of the Exodus plagues. But he says there isn't a real connection there because both of them are not describing historical events. So based off of his presupposition, he says there can't be a historical link, but he does acknowledge that there are these literary and linguistic parallels.
So in a way, if you try to strip away the worldview baggage or the paradigm that people often look at the biblical text, or in this case, poetry, you remove that and you just say, you look at the evidence, it's there. So it does show you how paradigms influence scholarly interpretations and conclusions. We always remind our audience of that, is these things are not done in a vacuum. But we need to move on to our next point here. And what's interesting is you draw this out after the 10 plagues. The Israelites depart Egypt. And, I had missed this in the text. Of course, this is famous. We always read the Bible and we miss things, right? Well, they plundered gold, silver, and clothing when they left.
Yeah, we have something that very closely parallels that in Ippur. One of the quotations would be, Gold, lapis lazuli, silver, turquoise, garnet, amethyst, diorite are fine stones have been hung on the necks of maidservants or female slaves. And this is another one of those really big, stark, that looks like the Exodus thing that people have noticed. And so again, we're pulling together multiple data points here. We're not just saying, all right, Nile River blood and gold, etc., on the necks of the slaves. There are many other things in there, but those are two really important ones to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, again, another piece of evidence. All right, the last connection we're going to make here, and you mentioned it at the beginning of our discussion, is sort of like how Ippawur is not pleased with the gods and with Pharaoh.
Exactly. That seems to be the purpose, or one of the main purposes of the poem, is to have this discussion with the gods and to criticize who he calls the All Lord, probably Ra, Amun Ra, and the Pharaoh. And so throughout the poem, he's actually indicting different gods, and he talks about how they're not present and they're not doing their job. He says they're not at the wheel. So they're supposed to be steering things in Egypt, controlling things and intervening to help the Egyptians who worship them, and yet they're not seen at all. All of this death and destruction and chaos keeps coming, and the gods of Egypt are powerless. And again, this is another thing. We read through the text of Exodus. That's exactly what is happening. In fact, that is one of the points of the story, that the gods of Egypt are powerless.
Yeah, it is quite remarkable. I'm certainly intrigued by this, and as I mentioned to you, I had dismissed this document personally, because I had read in the literature just briefly that, hey, it was earlier. Oh, okay, well then it doesn't fit. Let's comment on that, Titus. What the general observation you found when you were studying this, and what scholars said, why they dismissed it, and the way they dismissed it.
Well, when I would read the introductions to this text, and people would have translations and commentary of it, they wouldn't really get into details about why the composition was the first intermediate period or the Middle Kingdom or the second intermediate period, because the way they were approaching the text is that it was allegorical and it was not historical. And they weren't really looking and saying, this particular phrase or this word falls out of use, or this name is only found in this time period. And so it was just sort of assumed as time went on that this is the accepted date for it. And I didn't really like that. I thought, come on, we have to have solid reasons for this. Could it have been in the 8th dynasty? And so that's when I was looking into more of those types of details. But it's something that we find oftentimes in academia.
Yeah, and it's a lesson for the church and for folks who are just followers of Jesus, want to be faithful and walking with him. They hear all these kind of claims coming through the culture and academia, and it's always to stop and pause and say, we trust first what God says. When it comes to archaeology and science, all that is tentative, and we need to wait and hear more, hear the other side of the story. Now, Titus, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the Ippawur Papyrus because you've spent quite a bit of time studying it. We hope folks will consider what you've had to say and hopefully read Bible and Spade, where you lay out some of this evidence. Now let's talk a little bit about another possible connection, the Sphinx and the death of the firstborn.
So at the front of the Sphinx, in between the paws, Pharaoh Thutmose IV placed a stele. This is generally known as the Sphinx Dream Stele. And on it, he relates this strange story about how he was out hunting and he fell asleep during the afternoon. And then he had this dream, and the gods came and talked to him. And they told him, okay, clear away the sand from the Sphinx, and we're going to give you a blessing, and we're going to make you the Pharaoh. You're going to wear the crown. And so Egyptologists have looked at it and essentially said that he's giving this piece of propaganda. It's a divine endorsement to make his place as Pharaoh, as king, more legitimate, because there was some problem with the succession.
So in terms of the problems with the succession, the inference is possibly what?
That he wasn't the expected heir. And if we look into Egyptian history a bit deeper, we see that's the case. because he had an older brother named Amenhotep who just kind of disappeared from history. In Egyptian records, we don't know what happened to him. We don't know how he died, but he must have.
Yeah.
He was supposed to become the next pharaoh. And so there's the issue. And so when he gets this divine blessing, then it looks like, oh, the gods planned this all along. Even though my brother died and he was supposed to be pharaoh, the gods, they wanted me to be, and that was their plan.
Yeah. So that's their reinterpretation. If this is a connection to the Exodus and the death of the firstborn, that's their interpretation of the events. Again, the mind of man reinterpreting what God has done. So it's very fascinating. It's something for folks to consider. And in fact, you discuss that in your book on page 58. We encourage people to pick up a copy of that. But let's shift now, Titus, to an inscription found in the Sudan. And if I understand it right, you traveled there to take a look at this inscription. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but go ahead and tell us about that.
Yeah, I sort of initiated a little epigraphy examination project because I had read about this inscription in a few places, some of them kind of obscure, but I couldn't find any photographs of it. They just didn't exist. So I thought, all right, I need to go there, check this out, document it, and do some more analysis because this inscription mentions the land of the nomads of Yahweh. That seems pretty significant.
Yeah, well, it certainly is. I mean, not only just mentioning the name Yahweh, but if I understand it correctly, this is the oldest inscription with the name Yahweh on it. Let's talk about the dating a little bit and talk about the context.
Yeah, and the date and the context make it even more important, as you said. So the context is that it's on an Egyptian temple. It's at a place called Soleb. Now, this temple was built by or during the reign of Amenhotep III, and it was dedicated to him and to Amun-Ra. The date of it, of course, is going to be during his reign, but we can narrow that down a bit more. We could say basically that it's around 1400 BC without going into too many details. But if we put it there, then that's essentially right at the end of the wandering period, or just when the Israelites have entered into Canaan. And it's calling them nomads who worship Yahweh. Well, they were nomadic at that point.
Yeah, they didn't have their own land. If we understand the text, we have the wandering wilderness, and you have these nomads of Yahweh. I mean, what other explanation has there been offered? If I understand, the explanations are pretty weak, or based on presuppositions, sort of that don't accept the Exodus at all. Talk about that a little bit.
So, quite a few scholars actually admit that it is mentioning Yahweh, the God, the personal name of God that we find in the Old Testament. Some say that no, this is some place name, or some try to make it a different type of name. They alter the pronunciation and the reading. But so for those who accept that it is talking about Yahweh, God, they make the claim that, oh, this is how the development of Yahweh came about. It was first started in the area of Edom, roughly, kind of Sinai, Edom, Moab. And then the Israelites took this and they adopted Yahweh as their God.
So that's the way they try to get around. They try to get around what would be a much more straightforward interpretation, which is the one that you and I are taking.
Yeah, absolutely. But see, the major problem with trying to make it an Edomite God, Yahweh an Edomite God, is that when we go to Edomite inscriptions and we go to Yahweh inscriptions from the Iron Age, which the next latest one comes from the Iron Age, there's no indication of crossover. So Kos was the chief god of the Edomites, and he's different than Yahweh. The way that he's described, he's depicted. If we look at all the inscriptions about Yahweh from the time of ancient Israel, and starting, about the time of the Mesha Stele, for example, that would be one of the next earliest ones. There's no talk of an Edomite crossover. So it's just something that was theorized or hypothesized, but it is not backed by hard archaeological or inscriptional data.
It's more like a guess about how the name Yahweh got into an Egyptian text, because the real explanation can't be that there were Israelites really living in Egypt as the Bible describes, is really kind of like the supposition that seems to lurk behind all of this. But there's other information that's on this inscription that supports the argument that you're making.
Yeah, so one of the criticisms that's come up is that, oh, maybe this isn't talking about Yahweh, the God, or where does it place these people, and does that coincide with where the Israelites would be? Now, the one that people are most familiar with, the inscription, it comes from a pillar at this temple, and on that pillar, you have other nomads of such and such that are found on there. And these names include nomads of Tor Baal, which seems to be talking about the Semitic or Canaanite god Baal. And then you have the nomads of Beit Anat, which seems to be talking about the house of Anat. She's the Canaanite goddess. And then you have the nomads of Semet, which this one is not so clear, but there is a possible correlation to these people that are actually mentioned in 1 Chronicles 2:55, the Shemeathites. And maybe it's a name of some ancestor who adopted the tribe, or maybe it was a local god they worship. But the point is that at least two of these, if not the other three, are referring to deities. And so that helps us to be able to say this should be Yahweh, a deity. And the next part of that is the context. If we look at some of the area of the inscriptions, there's also a wall inscription from Soleb. There's a later wall inscription from Amara West, the temple there. And it's placing these nomads east of Egypt in this sort of Sinai, Edom, Moab area, exactly where we would expect the Israelites to be at the end of the wandering period. And then last thing is this phrase, nomads of Yahweh. This is something where we see similarities to how the Israelites are described in the book of Numbers, like the people of Yahweh, or the Israelites whom Yahweh made to wander in the wilderness. And so it's not like some really odd phrase that we couldn't conceive of connecting with them.
Yeah, it sounds to me possibly this is what they went by per se. It's in the biblical text as you're describing, and then we find it in this inscription. Again, just like with the Ipuwer papyrus, you start putting together the matrix of evidence. It's like a cold case in a way. It's forensic, We're reconstructing the past, so we have only pieces of data. But every time we do this, it seems when it relates to the Bible, the evidence seems to coincide very well, which doesn't surprise us, of course, because we believe it's the Word of God. Now, there's more to say about this inscription, but we've got to shift our discussion to another component of the matrix of evidence, and this is really one of my favorite subjects, is the Amarna letters. Tell the audience about what they are, the time period they're from, what they say, and let's have a conversation about that.
So the Amarna letters are so named because they were discovered at the site of Amarna. They were part of a royal archive. And these were letters that were written to the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh was storing them there. They were received by the Pharaoh from other people. There were many of these. We don't have all of them. About 382 have been recovered so far. But the ones that we're really looking in detail more are the ones that come from the kings or the mayors of Canaan. And they were writing to the Pharaoh. Most of these come from the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, although there are some earlier and later ones. But if we're talking about wandering and conquest period, again, we're looking at this Amenhotep III period.
So the descriptions, the connection now, so you're putting the chronology right around the time of the conquest, very close to the conquest, very early Judges period, like in that matrix of time.
Right.
And there are correspondence between the kings of Canaan, which is exactly what the book of Joshua describes them as, and Egypt. What are some of the things that these kings are saying to the Pharaoh, besides sucking up to him and telling him he's wonderful.
Yeah, they do that a lot sometimes. They are often asking the Pharaoh to send troops, to send military aid. And the reason for it, they state, is that they're losing cities, they're losing land. And they are talking about how these Habaru are coming in and taking over the land of the king. And yet they keep repeatedly asking the Pharaoh. We see the same kings continue to send requests again and again for troops. And so they apparently never got any reinforcement from Egypt. And while we could talk about that in reference to the conquest, since we're focused on the Exodus, I would say that this is an indicator that Egypt's army had suffered some severe losses at the time of the Exodus. And in this post-Exodus period, they were no longer able to send reinforcements to their vassals in Canaan to hold that territory.
Yeah, now for folks who are unfamiliar with this, Canaan was subjected to Tutmosis III in particular, so he would have been before the Exodus itself. And so the Exodus would have been an event that would have destroyed their power and control, which is what you're suggesting. And now, hey, the kings of Canaan are yelling about these Abiru, these marauders running around the land. And you're saying, well, that makes sense. Egypt has lost its power. It's really a fascinating connection.
Yeah, and if you look into Egyptian documents, for about 100 years after the proposed Exodus date, we see barely any Egyptian military activity. It's little stuff like putting down some rebellions or going after one city. It's not the kind of major campaigns that we saw just prior to the Exodus by pharaohs like Thutmose III.
Well, Titus, I can't believe it, but we've run out of time. We had some other things we wanted to talk about, but thank you so much for all you do, and thank you for coming on the show. We so appreciate your work and your fidelity to the Word of God.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here.
There's, of course, a lot more in Dr. Kennedy's book, Unearthing the Bible, so it's a pretty good resource to read through, and it isn't just about the Exodus, it's about the whole Bible. So you can get a copy anywhere books are sold, or you can also buy it from the ABR bookstore, and that helps the ABR ministry a little bit. That's all we have for today. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.